today, the First Lady, and she's expressed a desire to sing our song. So, here's how we do it. I hope Gary hasn't forgotten the tune. I hope you haven't forgotten the words. I hope I haven't forgotten the words. And I hope you haven't forgotten the words. One, two, three. Take me out to the ball. Me out to the moon. Buy me some.
The Monday Morning Quarterback on the 10th of December 2018, beaming down, up, across from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. Sorry about the voice today, but the sinuses are cold or something. It has us. It's something going around, no doubt about it. We'll try to use as less our voice as is possible here. We have a setup piece from e-j-dionnejr. He writes in the Washington Post about democracy and the grand old party. First of all, the whole concept of American democracy itself has been bent in many different directions by both of the monopoly parties. And then there's other ideas of democracy that are just utopian, no doubt about it. So thus the word is very strong. The Republicans, what they have done in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and in several other states, are in lame duck sessions, which means the states will change over as far as the governors in January. Thus, they have decided to curtail the powers of various governors in various states. And these legislatures, of course, were elected by gerrymandering, and that has been going on. But why is it happening now? Well, part of the reason is we had an article here in the Washington Post magazine. I don't have it up now, but effectively, many of the districts that flipped, especially in places like Orange County, California, and in Virginia and other places, are due to demographic shifts in terms of people and how people in those areas make their livelihoods. And that has happened in Virginia, so you're getting different types of people, younger people, etc. Are they necessarily more progressive than some of the others? They are in some instances. A lot of these people are more middle of the roadie, and these candidates have, of course, appealed to it. It was sort of like Hillary the Monster Clinton's 2016 campaign. The appeal there was to some of the same people, and she won those districts. And in California. But that didn't do anything for the progressive movement in California. What happened out there was they elected a governor named Gavin, who had been in Newsom, who had been the mayor of San Francisco and attacked the homeless. No doubt he is a standard bearer for corporate interests in California. And you can go down the line. Dianne Feinstein was reelected. She'll be there until she disappears, period. And she's been there, as LBJ would say, since Christ was a proverbial corporal. And she's still there with her type of politics, which is the same type of politics that was in the 80s. And that in itself was a reaction to much more progressive politics that came out of the 60s And then we, of course, had Watergate, a national disaster. And the Republican Party was on the ropes, as Uncle Carl said. But incidentally, on the week that was, we have Uncle Carl there. He was writing in the Wall Street Journal. That was when he got his start as a Bush person in 1972 or 73. One of those years as before Bush got into presidential sweepstakes. He actually ran against Ronald Reagan out of California in the 76 their election, and he did not get anywhere in that particular election. But in 1980, Reagan reappeared, and that was because of where the demographics were. He came out of California, out of Orange County. You had the Birches there, hard right, a constituency that had been well organized. Reagan had went from town to town, city to city, eating fried chicken, mashed potato dinners, and he was also on the stoop for GE. And if you recall, for those of us that are around, he was also on Death Valley Days as the announcer there. So in other words, his voice and his image were well known. He'd been the head of the Screen Actors Guild. That was when the late actor James Garner was the vice president. Garner was a progressive. Reagan didn't know what he was doing. He's not the first incompetent Republican to come in. The difference was that in the 80s you had Tip O'Neill was still in power, and the Democrats had the House and they had the Senate. That was the difference. So Reagan had to deal with them, period. And of course, then came the 90s, and Newt Gingrich popped in the mid-90s. That was after Bill Clinton had been elected. And that was after the first President Bush. He was elected in 1988. In 1989, he took office, and he left office in 1993. And Bill Clinton, Bill Clinton out of Arkansas, rode in. But he was a middle-of-the-road conservative type that gave us stronger sentencing on crack cocaine, incarcerated more African Americans than any other event since slavery, quite literally. So that was how the cards were stacked. And then you had gradually the Koch brothers investing in various other billionaires and millionaires, millions of dollars in think tanks and in elections on the state level, that they were able to get their state representative types into legislatures, and also they had a boilerplate of what kind of legislation they wanted to write. And it was all right-wing. That's what happened in Wisconsin. They finally were able to push Boss Walker in, and part of the problem they had there, they had a Democratic governor that again was the middle of the road. There's been an argument, and compelling argument. You can't run these middle of the road characters out there and expect progress. Progress comes very, very slowly. Other syndics would say, well, you can lose. Yes, you can lose very close elections when you run an Andrew Gillum in Florida, a Beto O'Rourke in Texas. But you're running, in Texas' case, against a 30-year legacy of Republicans being in the Senate from Texas, basically since LBJ left there. And then you had people like Conley that were conservative. So you have to understand you're running against a tide of people. And they were able to turn Texas more to the right than before. Thus, Texas has a third or fourth-rate education system. Healthcare in Texas is very lacking, and that is what happened. Now in Wisconsin, you have a situation there with the lame duck to strip the governor-elect Tommy Edwards of some of the power that he would have to fulfill his campaign promises, and also the Attorney General to pull Wisconsin out of the Affordable Care Act. Let me go here to e-j-dionnejr, especially after last week's court filing in the ongoing investigation of DJ Trump. His critics have good reason to focus on threats he poses to democracy and the rule of law. The president's not alone in his party. In case after case, Republicans have demonstrated an eagerness to undercut democracy and tilt the rules of the game, if doing so serves their ideological interests. The quiet coup by the GOP-controlled legislatures in Wisconsin, singular, is designed to defy the voters' wishes. It reflects an abandonment of the discipline that self-government requires. In November, the Wisconsin electorate ended 8 years of Boss Walker, Tommy Edwards as the governor, and Josh Coyle as as Attorney General. Democrats also won races for Secretary of State and the State Treasurer. There's nothing unnatural about this. The voters often tie one party and decide to try another party. It's a beautiful thing about constitutional democracy. There are no final victories, so there are no final defeats. We all agree to rules that apply uniformly, whether those we favor win or lose, because this protects our right to fight another day. That used to be the case. That it went out with the election of Reagan. Not so the Republicans in Wisconsin. Having lost the governorship, they used the lame duck session of the legislature to strip the elected governor, Evans, of many of the powers that were perfectly contented to see in Boss Walker exercise. Why are they doing this? Because Walker, who was defeated by Evans, is still there, and he can, of course, sign the bill, obviously. Amongst other things, the legislature would stop Evans from taking control of the State Economic Development Agency, a very important agency there in Wisconsin. And the Democrats have pledged to abolish, and it would make it harder for him to overturn restrictions Walker imposed on social benefits. It would also limit early voting, which helped the Democrats to win by expanding the turnout. For good measure, the legislature wants to prevent Coyle from withdrawing the state from the lawsuit against the Affordable Care Act. It's not surprising to learn that that Republicans are shifting power to state legislatures because radical gerrymandering districts help the Republicans maintain their majority in the state Senate and the Assembly, despite Democrats' performance. And this is kind of a mirror thing of what happens between the House of Representatives, where Democrats are very successful, and the Senate not so. The Democrats won the popular vote in the state Assembly, contested by a majority of 54% to 46%, but emerged with only 36 seats to the Republicans' 63. You can forget that one. Evans denounced the hot mess the legislature has created. Said Sunday night on NBC's Meet the Press that he urged Walker to veto the bill. Walker will not do that. And we go on to Michigan. Target incoming Secretary of State there, Jocelyn Benson, who, like other Democratic Secretaries of State, was elected on an ambitious reform agenda. This includes greater transparency when it comes to political money. Republicans don't like this. That is in Michigan. Both are borrowing from the playbook by Republicans in North Carolina. There is Governor Cooper soon after his election in 2016. Michael Hobbs reported in the HuffPost the GOP legislatures were also trying to dilute the progressive reforms, referendum victories in the state, such as in Florida and in Utah. So this is just not combined to one state. And then he gives the example of when Republicans win governorships in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and also in Maryland in 2014 and in Vermont in 2016, Democratic legislatures made no power grab. Well, that speaks for itself. The anti-democratic impulses for the GOP are far more in common with the old segregationist Democrats of the South and the best Republican traditions that lead to rights conferred in the 14th and 15th Amendment. Well, that was a long time ago. The efforts to lock in the power regardless of election outcomes, and also an eerie echo some of the behavior of anti-democratic politicians abroad. Well, the nation is beginning, the American nation is looking more like a banana republic every day. It has a chief executive officer in DJ Trump that can't get his cabinet together. His new ambassador, supposedly designated as to the UN, is not qualified. And the young man that Ayers, I think was his name, was going to be his chief of staff, said no, he didn't want the job. So in other words, what's happening in the duck, and that's where DJ Trump's in his last 2 years, his staff was always weak, his general staff. Now it's weaker, completely outfitted with dummies. So that's what you're up against. You have these expeditions like at the border with Mexico, and nothing came out of it. The caravan is still there in the Tijuana, as some of them have went home. Others are taking jobs in Mexico. So that is where you are with that. The rest of the border, we haven't heard from them. They were out stringing razor wire around and sitting out there and eating prepared meals. We used to call them sea rations anyway. So that's basically where that thing went. It was a flop, but it was during the election to motivate, quote-unquote, his base. There's a very good article, again, in the Post about his base. We'll get it in another broadcast when I have more voice. Well, let me finish this up here. But most in the party, this is the Republican Party, are either complacent or silent, and it's any wonder then that most Republicans are also willing to go right along with Trump. Well, they have no place else to go. They know that. Old man McConnell knows that, and that is why he's been stagnant there. But part of the problem is this is all short-term. And when you get a nation into short-term events in an environment, both politically and economically and socially, that is very dynamic and not stagnant. There was a time in the 50s, those things were more stagnant. They were still somewhat stagnant in the 60s. Although you had the Vietnam War, you had protests, you had the Civil Rights Movement with Dr. King there. But Dr. King, primarily until he went to Chicago, went to Cicero, was confined to some cities in the South. Different program altogether. But still, the economic times were decent. Most people had a job. African American home ownership was much higher than today. So was the number of people employed, although vast discrimination was there. And in places like Mississippi, the poverty level was much, much more severe. Some of that has changed. Casinos have popped up on the Gulf Coast. But at the same time, what has happened, we talked about this, and we invite you to tune in to the Open Source Report. That's our technical report about technical companies moving from the Bay, San Francisco, to places like El Paso, where the standard of living is much cheaper. A salary there is under $1,000 compared with roughly $2,500 in San Francisco. That was so weekly. So in other words, you can see the difference there immediately. Things are happening. The nature of work is changing. GM and many of the larger corporations have layoffs planned for 2019. There's no doubt about that. They are going to be making redundancies. And that has undercut Trump's plan of quote-unquote jobs. And then there's the tariffs that hit the Midwest, etc. Now there's a big row with Howie and their CFO in Canada. Where that goes, we don't know. And across the pond, May and Brexit is on the rug. Where that goes, nobody knows. So in other words, there's a great deal of uncertainty out there. Let me just check on our time, and we'll get to the machinations at NPR. Evidently, NPR has went into, according to this, has an army of temps face a workplace of anxiety and insecurity at NPR. This is somebody named Julia Bodereau was happy to catch on, determined to stay at NPR after completing an internship in D.C. She began a year-long stint as a temporary worker, moving through production jobs, signature news programs like All Things Considered and The Morning Edition. Bodereau quickly realized that she was up against as a temp. She was floating amongst unfamiliar co-workers, facing even ever-changing sets of responsibility, and some of which she had never been trained there. And this just goes with a lot of temporary workers. Her work contracts were somewhat brief, as 2 weeks, and at the end of which she had to persuade a manager to extend her. Worse was a sense of constant competition amongst fellow temps, many of whom were angling to be hired for a limited number of permanent positions. The only person I felt I could trust, she said, was the person I was dating, who was in the same position as I was. After a year of such uncertainty, she left, taking a job as a reporter for a group of public radio stations in New York State. What was surprising about Bodereau's experience is how unscrupulous or unsurprising it is at NPR. For decades, a public broadcaster had relied on a cadre of temporary journalists to produce its hourly cast and temporary news and popular news programs. Without temporary workers who were subject to termination without cause, NPR would have been unable to be NPR. Temps all do most important jobs in the newsroom. They pitch ideas, assign stories, edit them, report, and produce. Temps not only book the guests heard in the interviews, but they often write the questions the hosts ask the guests. A plantation environment. There are a lot of them, according to the union. Between 20 and 22% of the 483 union-covered newsroom workforce, or 1 in 5 are temporary workers. NPR's managers cite somewhat lower figures at 16%. Well, it's too many, it doesn't matter. Resentment among temporaries about the status has boiled beneath the surface at NPR for years, but the tensions have begun to bubble up over the past several months. Some temporary workers raised complaints in the wake of sexual harassment, a scandal involving the former head of NPR's newsroom, misconduct there. By any measure, NPR is unusual amongst broadcast media organizations in the size of its temporary workforce. Amongst them, temps are often left in the dark about how long their assignments would last, how long they will be, how much they will be paid, etc. 5% of the staff at a typical TV station was employed on a part-time or temporary basis, according to a survey conducted. This is the Radio TV Digital News Association. Radio stations, which usually have smaller staffs than TV stations, reported on the average just the one part-time or temp in the survey. The number of temps amongst stations have declined over the past years as the recession has eased. That's according to Robert Papa. But in other kinds of news organizations employ fewer temps. The only journalists officially designated as temporary in the Washington Post newsroom, are 6 extended interns who are employed with the expectation they will someday fill a permanent position when an appropriate one opens up. That's according to the managing editor, Tracy Grant. Hires temps to aggressive wide. This is NPR. That's the president of operations, Lauren Mayer. She says temp workers fill in for permanent staff when the latter go on holiday, take sick leave, etc. At media companies, they strive to be innovative and nimble. We need talented people who can come in for short term, which is a lie. NPR temps are guaranteed minimum wages under the contract. That's what the Screen Actors Guild, the American Federation of TV and Radio Artists, the labor union that represents most of the workers. The pay scale starts at around $21 an hour, or about $45,000 a year, based on a 52 weeks, full-time basis. But they don't usually get that. Temporary workers who qualify for health insurance and other benefits if they work more than 30 hours in a 2-week pay period, which they usually don't. Like Botero, several say they didn't feel prepared for some of the assignments that they get. I feel like I couldn't take Christmas off. I couldn't go to my high school reunion because if I did, I'd be out of the loop. So they had to stay in the loop. One former temp said she spent 3 years in various jobs at the so-called morning edition, All Things Considered, and its weekend version before giving up hope and landing a permanent position. Her responsibilities ran the gamut: editing, researching, pitching story ideas, writing segments, mixing or recording, and doing interviews. She applied for jobs when they came open, but never got hired permanently. At one point, I was really frustrated. She said, you ask yourself, why am I doing this? And no one will hire me. So she left and eventually landed a job as a producer at a podcasting company, of all things. So this is some of the gamut here. The most significant changes in NPR in April. In April, converted 26 positions that had been filled by temporaries into permanent jobs. The union said of all positions were held by temps who on their job for more than a year. So the temp jobs will be permanent in the future, although she had no firm commitment. This is a manager there. Mayor said NPR's goal is not to eliminate the use of temps, but to make sure we are employing temps for the right reasons. Well, one of the big problems that I would venture, they're having problems getting temporary workers to come forward. Let me transition on here to ESPN and do the sports with the National Basketball League and the National Hockey League. And then we'll come back, and this is from Sunday night, incidentally, in the NBA. The Pacers were in the Motor City. Pacers 116-108 over the Pistons. The Bucks were at the rafters. Bucks 104-99 for the rafters. And the Jazz were in San Antonio. Spurs 110-97 for the Jazz. And finally, the Hornets and Knickerbockers in New York. It was the Hornets 119-107. And we'll get a little music here. Maybe we want. Yeah, we did. The Canucks and Blues in St. Louis. It was Canucks 6-1. The Flyers and the Jets of Winnipeg. It was Jets 7-1 was the final there. The Bruins and the Senators in an overtime. The Bruins won that one 2-1. The Canucks and Blackhawks in Chicago. Canucks 3-2 in that contest. The Devils and the Anaheim Ducks in another overtime game. It was it was tied 6-6. The Flames and Oilers. It was the Oilers 1-0. They shut out the Flames. And finally, the Stars and the Golden Knights. I like that name. It was the Golden Knights 4-2. Now let me go back out to San Diego quickly here. and see what the latest news on the caravans. San Diego migrant shelter at capacity. Volunteers scramble for solutions with the San Diego shelter at and this is by Kate Moisey. Volunteers found out late Saturday that immigration officials would be releasing 2 more busloads of families before the night was over. The shelter that opened several weeks ago to temporarily house families released by the immigration authorities. Volunteers from the San Diego Rapid Response Network, a collection of initially organized to respond to interior immigration enforcement activities, dropped what they were doing and raced to the Greyhound station in Yesandro. The first bus of about 40 people made up of families seeking asylum from countries like Honduras, Guatemala, was supposed to arrive at 6 p.m. They were told the families released by the Immigration and Customs authorities had come to San Diego either through the asylum line at San Jacinto port of entry or by going over the border barrier and asking agents that caught them for asylum. They spent several days in holding cells at the port of entry or border patrol stations while they were processed. And they were fitted with ankle monitors and then released in order to appear in the immigration court. The volunteers brought blankets in case the new families needed to stay the night. It's not the first time this week volunteers haven't known where they were going to put someone. That's according to Kevin Malone, executive director of San Diego Organizing Project. Every day it looks like we may have to lead people on the streets. We have been pitching this thing together minute by minute. Patching. The second bus with another 23 pulled up at 8 p.m. Volunteers worked to organize boat groups. A call came in that changed everything. The families that would have a place to stay that night, announced one of the volunteers, Kathy Stradler, with vigil relief on her thing. A church had offered to take them in until the space had been made a temporary shelter the next day. Amongst those facing possible sleeping outdoors at the bus station overnight, one person here, 40 years old, from Guatemala. And let's see, she tried to ask for asylum at the port of entry, she said, but was told to leave. City of San Diego, along with the county and National City and Chula Vista, I'm not sure where it is, somewhere around there, sent letters to the state requesting state-owned armories be opened so families can move in there. The shelters currently located have the capacity set of just under 100. Organizers have been trying to negotiate with the city, arguing that because the shelter is for short-term stays and an emergency, that they should get that out. Anyway, the Rapid Response Network worries that ICE has dropped off families at the bus station at bus stations around the country without alerting their groups. When asked, ICE has said it doesn't routinely notify NGOs unless people are being dropped off to their shelters. So this is the first time I'd heard about the dropping off of people, something new, a new wrinkle. We'll put this up on Facebook so people will be able to look and weep, so to speak. Let's see what else we have going on here. We usually save a few things out here. We won't get into Medicare for All. It'll be a special program. Incidentally, the Washington Post has a very good series on income inequality. We are not going into it here. But we will have a future broadcast where we get to talk about it. Now, this is a Washington Post magazine article. It's the economy stupid is the it's the economy's as stupid is the title. This is the Washington Post magazine. The key to understanding the 2018 midterm election and the future of American politics is an ideology of culture. It's a different economies of red and blue states. It's off a little bit of this. On the evening that was of November the 6th, brought the latest visual manifestation of our highly divided country, the midterm election. The map was similar to previous elections, blue on the coast, and across the rest of the country, wide swaths of red interrupted the blue dots. The major change was in the size of those blue dots. Increasingly, they seemed to be composed of both large cities, suburban, and suburbs that surround them. They call them extraburbs usually. And some of the old issues there, such as Mr. Colin Kaepernick, etc., were forgotten about, and Dr. Ford, Bessie Ford, yet in the map of those expanding blue dots was a clue to another lens, one that gets short shifts in explaining the fractioning of our country. The lens is economics. For the past 50 years, America's industrial economy, based on the production of steel, ships, cars, textiles, and other goods that were often made by factory workers on assembly lines, plus service jobs that flourished around them, have declined. Many of the old industry sectors have become automated, and they produce more with fewer workers. Other industries have moved abroad. The old industrial economy was based in cities such as Chicago, Gary. The guy from Gary was telling me the other day they got basically a one-street town now. Muncie, Akron, Ohio, Allentown, Pittsburgh, southern towns like Mobile, Greensboro. The blue-collar workers tend to live in the cities, and the white-collar workers and managers in the suburbs. Metropolitan areas that specialize in knowledge-based economies have prospered and expanded onward, and this is the point they're making. Some areas in Chicago and Los Angeles include older, low-income, mostly African-American inner-city neighborhoods, but African-Americans also increasingly moved into middle-class suburbs like Prince George County, that's outside of D.C. African-Americans in the suburbs of the 20 largest metro areas have grown to 7.1%, while the urban population grew by barely 0.1%. And he goes on to list some. We're kind of moving on here with this. Many Americans, primarily but not all Europeans, who once lived in comfortably old Midwest and southern towns, have had important parts of their identity stripped away by the transformation of the U.S. economy. Many of them once enjoyed lifetime employment at the GMs and Sears of the world. Well, Sears is about out of the game. They lived in neighborhoods, frequent the same bars, etc. The companies have left, the unions are gone, and many working-class Europeans, like Trump supporters in Ohio, I interviewed for my last book, had moved to nearby suburbs, where the main public square is a shopping mall, as identities are made possible by older jobs, older economies have faded away. People in industrial America have had many of their identities stripped away, and that is part of what is going on here. New identities emerge, and let me finish this up here. It's quite a long article. Something very similar happened in Houston and Dallas, where Democrats won in highly educated, wealthy suburban districts that Republicans had long controlled. That was where George H.W. Bush was out of. Democrats also scored in other metro areas that Republicans had previously dominated. Kansas City, Kansas, the home of Sprint. Sharice Davies, a Native American lesbian, ousted a Republican representative there. That was Kevin Yoder, who had been around for a while. In southern Minnesota, meanwhile, Republicans flipped a seat. That is a microcosm of The electoral divide. The district is split between Rochester, 115,000 people, the Mayo Clinic, and votes Democrat. The former manufacturing and farm towns to the west have attracted immigrant farm workers and have very few college graduates, and have become dependently Republican. The Republican candidate relied on a margin outside of Rochester, nearly upsetting. And that was a district where the governor of Minnesota came from, that House district there. It's hard to imagine America finally confronting the differences in prosperity and prospects between red and blue areas as long as Trump and his tweets occupy the center stage, transfixing Democrats and Republicans alike. Yet the stake of America's future, we are going to find a way to talk honestly. This is John B. Julius. He's the author of the Nationalist Review, Trade, Immigration, and Revolt Against Globalism. So this is very important. We're glad we got it in. This will end our broadcast on the 10th of December 2018 from WBRN Radio and the Boston Red Network. Old Boston Red here, struggling with his voice. Anyway, we'll see you soon. Good day. And we're in the Jerry Pippin broadcast, but we don't want to forget that out. We honor Jerry Pippin every Monday morning quarterback, incidentally, but died in 2015.